The number of self-identifying Christians is at an all-time low in the United States. And this includes both Protestant denominations and Catholicism, while religious nones, or just people that are unaffiliated with religion, agnosticism and atheism, have almost doubled in each of these categories, according to Pew Research. This has been the trend for 50 years, and it's no coincidence that America began to plunge down a ravine of immoral insanity after the cultural chaos that was the 1960s. The modern feminist movement began around 1963. The first birth control pill was approved by the FDA in 1960. Both of these things led to the sexual revolution, which began in the 60s. This would lead to the legalization of abortion in 1973 in Roe v. Wade. The 60s also saw an explosion of drug abuse, including mass experimentation with psychedelic drugs, marijuana use skyrocketed, and prayer in schools was adjudicated in the Supreme Court in 1962. Playboy's first issue was just 9 years prior to that. The 60s also saw an emergence of existentialism and postmodernism, the latter challenging the very idea of objective truth and authority. And finally, the sprinkles on this putrid pièce de résistance was half a century of malnutrition in the body of Christ. The church became primarily focused on numbers and attendance instead of worship and discipleship. And in turn, the church failed to be the salt and light it was meant to be, and the inevitable result of all this is the absolute cultural decimation we bear witness to now. However, America is no less religious than it was 60 years ago. Why do I say that? At some point in the last year, I did an episode called The Divine Limits of Liberty, in which I said the following. Religion is what you believe. It is the worship of something. Everyone believes something. Everyone worships something. There is no one irreligious. If you do not worship God, you worship the self or an idol. In other words, every single person that has ever consciously lived is religious and participates in worship. If there is no such thing as an irreligious person, and that it's impossible to separate a person or largely a society from religion, what is America's new religion? We're obviously not a Christian nation anymore, not in reality. We've legalized recreational drug use. In certain cities, we have designated drug zones. We've not only legalized same-sex marriage, but we celebrate it and punish people who don't. We punish churches for holding worship services during a time of sickness. We imprison people for praying outside of baby murder clinics. We're voluntarily mutilating and chemically castrating adults and worse, minors, to comport with their sexual fantasies. We're now calling pedophiles minor attracted persons. We're erecting satanic statues in state capitol buildings. The current leading presidential candidate won't take a stance on baby killing because he knows he'll get more votes. And the current president is recognizing so-called transgender persons on Easter, the most important day on the Christian's calendar. All of this is a direct consequence of the secularization of the church beginning half a century ago, the modern feminist movement, the sexual revolution, and the eruption of drug abuse. So again, I ask, if Christianity is not America's religion, but religion is inseparable from the individual or the society, what is America's new religion? To be religious is simply to be devoted to an acknowledged reality or deity. Religion is a personal set of beliefs, attitudes, and practices. Organized religion is when there is a group of individuals who share common beliefs. Therefore, by definition, atheists are just as religious as monotheists. They don't differ in their religiosity, but by their beliefs or conclusions about the ultimate reality. The word religion means to be bound to something. It comes from the ancient Latin word religare, which literally means to bind again. So it originally referred to something like a devotion to a system of beliefs and practices or rituals. That means, etymologically speaking, religion speaks to your adherence to belief, what we may call faith. So whereas Christianity once defined America's moral basis and cultural compass, this has been almost entirely replaced by some other faith. This is the question that we will answer today. This marked transition was perfectly embodied on Easter, pun intended. The White House made a pointed, blatant proclamation on Good Friday, the day we honor and remember the selfless sacrifice of Christ as he shed his blood, was tortured, and crucified on behalf of our sin. Here's some of what the proclamation read. On Transgender Day of Visibility, we honor the extraordinary courage and contributions of transgender Americans and reaffirm our nation's commitment to forming a more perfect union where all people are created equal and treated equally throughout their lives. Biden touts his record of appointing transgender Americans to our nation's highest offices, and that his administration ended the ban on transgender persons in the military. And let's not forget the Respect for Marriage Act that he signed into law. Then he said, transgender Americans are part of the fabric of our nation. Whether serving their communities or in the military, raising families, or running businesses, they help America thrive. They deserve and are entitled to the same rights and freedoms as every other American, including the most fundamental freedom to be their true selves. Yes, where would we be without transgenderism, after all? Biden would also say, today we send a message to all transgender Americans. You are loved. You are heard. You are understood. You belong. You are America. And my entire administration and I have your back. Now, this ending is important. Remember, this was on Good Friday as a proclamation for Easter Sunday, March 31st. Biden said, now, therefore, I, Joseph R. Biden Jr., President of the United States of America, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, do hereby proclaim March 31st, 2024 as Transgender Day of Visibility. I call upon all Americans to join us in lifting up the lives and voices of transgender people throughout our nation and to work toward eliminating violence and discrimination based on gender identity. And by violence, they mean speaking in opposition to it. So instead of lifting up Christ, the resurrected King, we're supposed to lift up transgender people. Now, I know that this so-called holiday, which means holy day, was adopted a year or so ago for March 31st to be every year on that date. But this proclamation is an obviously pointed assault on Christianity and other monotheistic religions, belief groups, who believe transgenderism is immoral and wrong. And Biden wasn't the only one making this sort of proclamation. New York Governor Kathy Hochul said, trans rights are human rights, and I'm proud that we've taken nation-leading action to protect and affirm transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming New Yorkers. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, said, today and every day, let's commit to creating a world where all transgender people are treated with dignity and respect that everyone is due. And there are similar statements from Gavin Newsom and Nancy Pelosi, among several others of our nation's leaders. Here's what former Republican Congressman Dave Jolly had to say on Easter Sunday.
I think we got to hit it head on and suggest to President Trump and Mike Johnson and Senator Blackburn and others who are relying on the words of their Christ and their Jesus they celebrate today to condemn Joe Biden, to suggest to them that actually the Jesus they celebrate today would be inclusive of the transgendered community and would be supportive of the transgendered community and command all Christians, including Donald Trump, Mike Johnson, and others who celebrate today, that in fact they should love the transgendered community as they love their own God. I am not sure the theology upon which they rely to criticize Joe Biden.
A few corrections for former Congressman Jolly here. There is no such thing as this subjective Christ as you're suggesting by saying their Christ and their Jesus. Donald Trump has never demonstrated any evidence of genuine Christianity. Jesus would have never been inclusive of transgender persons by your standards of inclusivity, meaning affirmation, because he would have told them outright that they must not continue down this sexual, perverse, and destructive path. And this flows from his love and holiness. Which brings me to the all-important point that we have a fundamental disagreement on what loving our neighbor looks like. You define love as affirmation and acceptance, as Christ, and by extension his followers, define love as the impeccable balance of grace and truth. Truth being that thing which sets us free. The word of Christ makes it abundantly clear that a person's whole identification with sexual sin leads to eternal death, a rejection from eternal paradise, because it's an unholy deviation from God's standards of morality and sexuality. That's our theology. And Joe Biden is as Catholic as I am African American. This was perfectly demonstrated by the Archbishop of Washington, Wilton Cardinal Gregory, on Easter Sunday. Watch.
In the case of the president, do you get a sense that his regular attendance and adherence to the faith resonates with American Catholics?
I would say that he's very sincere about his faith, but like a number of Catholics, he picks and chooses dimensions of the faith to highlight while ignoring or even contradicting other parts. There is a phrase that we have used in the past, a cafeteria Catholic. You choose that which is attractive and dismiss that which is challenging.
Or, as Thomas Aquinas would say, you allow your conscience to guide you.
Correction. Thomas Aquinas never said anything remotely similar to this, and he would have vehemently denied the claim that you just let your conscience guide you. But Wilton Cardinal Gregory, the Archbishop of Washington, perfectly and delicately described Joe Biden's cafeteria Catholicism, which is to say, he's not a Christian at all, because you don't get to pick and choose things, and any serious Christian or Catholic knows that. Coincidentally, on the same day, Easter Sunday, the world's foremost atheist, Richard Dawkins, said the following.
Well, I must say I was slightly horrified to hear that Ramadan is being promoted instead. I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. And so, I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense. It's truth that statistically the number of people who actually believe in Christianity is going down, and I'm happy with that. But I would not be happy if, for example, we lost all our cathedrals and our beautiful parish churches. So I count myself a cultural Christian. I think it would matter if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful.
Well, that was a catastrophic, contradictory mess. And again, I must reiterate that one cannot pick and choose which parts of Christianity they espouse. You cannot simultaneously cheer for the demise of the Christian church, and most importantly, reject the deity of Jesus Christ, and call yourself a cultural Christian. And by that, he, of course, means that Jesus was nice and Christians used to be profound artists. That's why he mourns the loss of cathedrals and hymns. Okay, so all of this sets the stage for our understanding of what is the new religion of our society, of the Western world, not only in America, what do we worship? And who is our God? Well, let's begin with the divine writings in Exodus. Written nearly 3,000 years ago, God gives to Moses to give to his people the Ten Commandments. He begins with these two commands. The proper name for God in the Old Testament writings was Yahweh. Sometimes we say Jehovah. He says in Exodus 20, verse 3, "You shall have no other gods before me." The Hebrew word for before here is the word al, which is simply a preposition meaning above or over. So therefore, here, God is saying that nothing at all should come before him or over him. Nothing should be above him. He should be your number one priority. He should be the ultimate primary focus of your life. This is not to be misinterpreted to mean that one may worship other gods as long as they fall beneath Yahweh, because God would later say to the prophet Isaiah, "I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God." The second commandment is very similar. God says in Exodus 20, 4 through 5, "You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." When you place anything above God, that thing becomes an idol. Though God was literally describing handmade objects that people worshipped as if they were deities, gods, he says, "You must not shakal," which is Hebrew for to bow down. He also says not to obad them, which is Hebrew for serve. So the idea here is that we are commanded to, in the second commandment, not to bow down and serve anything in the place of God. Jesus himself reinforced this when he was asked, which was the greatest commandment? To which he replied at first, he said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." Now, getting back to Moses, let's consider the cultural context of God's commands in the commandments. In Moses' day, in the ancient world, there were two deities worshipped throughout the Middle East, Baal and Ashtaroth. Baal is mentioned all throughout the Old Testament in Judges, 1 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, Jeremiah, Hosea, and Zephaniah. In total, this name in its singular form or its plural form occurs 80 times. So Baal or Balaam. The Semitic name simply means Lord or Master. So contextually and historically, Baal was the sort of like the general name given to gods that were not Yahweh. Baal was associated with things mainly concerning agriculture, which is to say that he was like the god of material wealth or materialism. Ashtoreth, this other one, is only mentioned a few times in the Old Testament, but this goddess went by different names in different cultures, like Astarte to the Phoenicians, Ishtar to the Mesopotamians, and Aphrodite to the Greeks. She was the goddess of love, sex, fertility, romance, and reproduction. And around the writing of the commandments, the Phoenicians and the Canaanites worshipped this goddess by sacred prostitution in her temple, as the Greeks would also do in their time. Like, this is why the letters to the Corinthians talk so much about sexual immorality. In other words, the two main areas of idol worship were materialism and sex. Israel would ultimately violate this command in respect to both of these false gods, these idols. The book of Judges tells us, "The sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods who were among the gods of the peoples who were around them," so other people groups, "and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord, and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. The Israelites failed to worship Yahweh alone, and so they sinned against God by worshiping materialism and sex, idolized in these false deities. Now, of course, this was not only a problem for the Jews. All of history and modernity demonstrates severe idolatry in respect to Gentiles or all of those people who are not Jewish. The Apostle Paul would write about this to the Romans around 60 AD, yet it's true for our society in 2024. Listen to this. Paul, he's speaking about the progression of unrighteousness and simultaneously the progression of God's righteous judgment in Romans chapter 1 when he says this: "For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened." This shows us the initial violation, the outset of unbelief. Verse 18 talks about their suppression of the truth. And that's referring to the truth about God, the truth of God. So there is, from the very get-go, a rejection of God as God. This is the catalyst of idolatry. So now that the truth has been suppressed or denied, and now that God is not God to them, something else must naturally take his place, and this darkened void points us in the direction of divine judgment. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. I think the first thing we must realize is that the fool fancies himself a genius. Don't forget that they've suppressed and rejected what is actually true, which is to say, they have rejected God, because God is the ultimate truth and the ultimate reality. And in similar fashion to the gaping God hole they now have, a fantasy must replace reality in their hearts and minds. Thus, they become the possessor and the professor of what they deem to be true. And it follows that they've replaced God with one of the three forms of idolatry: worshiping the self, worshiping somebody else, or worshiping an object or thing. Now, watch the progression. "For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. The men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts." Paul says they exchanged, which is a word meaning to change or alter. They altered the truth for a lie. And Paul actually uses a definite article there to say that they changed the truth of God for the lie. What is the lie? We'll hold on to that for a moment. There is no mistake right here or misinterpretation that Paul is speaking about the sin of homosexuality. And this was 2,000 years ago. But this is within the context of idolatry and its ensuing judgment. We'll see more examples in just a moment, but these sinners are worshiping themselves. They are their own God. They're doing what they want to do, which in this case is a sexually perverse lifestyle. One could also describe this in similar fashion to the worship of Ashtoreth, or making sex an idol. Now, here's God's reaction, and keep in mind that God's nature demands a just response to unrighteousness. So God is by no means passive. It's not like he's just sitting by doing nothing. Here's what happens. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over. He gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper. Pause. Again, this is God's judgment against idolatry. Worshipping anything or anyone other than Yahweh. He gives them over. He lets them do what they want to do. And that is enough judgment in itself to allow them their own destruction. The progression of sin and judgment iterates itself in the following behaviors. Being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. These things are how the sin of idolatry manifests itself. And Paul describes it in the communal sense. So follow the progression. What begins as an individual's rejection of God consequently leads to societies defined by their evil. Contextually, the lie that Paul speaks of concerns idolatry. Idolatry is the inception of all sin. Think about it. Every single sin that has ever been committed was committed because the truth was suppressed. God was rejected. We said, no, God. The self was worshipped. It's all idolatry. And this is true even for the very first sin in the history of humanity. In the Garden of Eden, this is how Satan tempted them. Eve says that God forbade them from eating from a certain tree or to even touch it lest they die. And look at what Satan says to them. He said, "You surely will not die, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God." The King James Version there says, "Ye shall be as gods." So the very first temptation and sins were idolatry. The point here is that worship and religion are inescapable. There is no such thing as religious neutrality. The moment and the occasion that you reject the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you don't cease worshiping. Your worship is only diverted elsewhere. And that is, as is demonstrated by this Holy Scripture, idol worship is most often directed upon the self. We establish a throne of our own making. Outside of the commandments, idolatry is expressly condemned in the Scriptures. 1 Corinthians 10:14 says that we're to flee idolatry. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10, Ephesians 5:5, Revelation 21:8, and 22:15 all demonstrate that idolaters will not inherit the kingdom of God. Peter describes idolatry as a hallmark of our former lives before Christ. And Paul says that we're not to even associate with people who are idolaters in 1 Corinthians 5:11. The idolic practice of making ourselves kings and queens and rulers of our own lives is the antithesis of Jesus' call to follow him. He describes Christianity as a sort of death to the self when he said, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." The new religion of the Western world is the worship of the self. We have progressed, or rather regressed, to this point over the last century, which perfectly explains the tenets and practices and virtues of this new religion, which plague our culture today. Abortion is the worship of the self. Sexual freedom is the worship of the self, etc., etc., etc. And it is to this religion that the West is deeply devoted, which it goes by different names, the foremost of which is liberalism. This is why you can teach the religion of evolution, but one cannot dare teach creationism. This is why schools can propagate pornographic material and literature, but one cannot dare admonish biblical morality. And once again, this is why Easter this year shared the calendar with the Transgender Day of Visibility. America is undoubtedly suffering from the progressive judgment of the Almighty God. Now, To be fair, here's what Donald Trump had to say about Biden's proclamation.
Such total disrespect to Christians, and November 5th is going to be called something else. You know, it's going to be called Christian Visibility Day, when Christians turn out in numbers that nobody has ever seen before. Let's call it Christian Visibility Day, all right?
November 5th is Election Day, so the former president and leading candidate is implying that Christians should show up to speak their resistance to this new religion en masse. And I hope he's right about that, but that will really only scratch the surface. We've got to get our own house in order first, and it's then and only then that we can begin to be the salt and light of the earth, to defeat this new religion and return our nation to the true religion and our national roots. Thanks for watching this clip. Listen, I want to make sure that you stay informed on the news and the biblical response to it. So do yourself and us a favor and hit the subscribe button before you go today. And then we would love for you to check out WeTheFreeShow.com to grab yourself some merch to spread the word of We The Free. And we're also going to put a video on the screen that we think that you'll like right now. Now, go be the salt and light, and we'll see you next time.